You know, I've often said the most important price in the economy is the exchange rate. And you can see just how significant it is right now. I mean, here we are with huge terms of trade like we've never seen before, certainly not in my lifetime. And if the exchange rate wasn't at 96 or 7 cents or 93 cents yesterday, then the terms of trade shock of income would be so explosive to the general economy and to inflation that the place would have been blown to pieces. But the exchange rate again has moved out. It's gone from 48 cents in 1997-8 and has moved out to now 96 cents to take the primary shock. But if the primary shock was only being taken by interest rates, you can imagine the kind of interest rate we would need to dampen domestic activity in the face of the income surge from abroad. So again, the flexibility is there, and not only that, we're now seeing, which we never had in Howard's years, of course, the flexibility in wages through enterprise bargaining and with it the safety net. No centralised system, no leapfrogging, no interconnectedness in wages. You know the old game, you know, in the old days a developer in Melbourne would want to finish his building to get his head tenant in. It might be a bank or a set of accountants or something, or one of the big accountancy firms, and they'd vary the metals construction award. They would essentially pay up, and the metals construction award would be varied, and immediately it was the metals manufacturing award would be varied. So some little metal spinner in Marrickville here in Sydney would pay the increase in the rate. And then the clerks would get their go the next time round, and away it went, all the way around. When I introduced enterprise bargaining, I pulled the teeth out of the ACTU's head. There was no more leapfrogging. Finished. So now you've got that flexibility of real sectors where productivity is greater, with a focus on productivity, where productivity can actually afford to pay a wage to a better group and not afford to pay a wage to a less good group, which was not the case in the old days. He says, and I'll read this, 143, it's important, some of these things. The floating exchange rate protection of the 1990s worked so well because despite the sustained sneers of the Howard government through its long term of office, Paul Keating left John Howard with a domestic economy that for a time was pretty much a model of rectitude. Productivity was sustained at a high enough rate to keep domestic inflation very low in the face of strong rising demand. Prices did not rise unduly, yet profit margins kept investment rising at a pace that steadily lifted employment and tax revenues to remarkable levels. Spurred on by the new forms of saving available to ordinary workers, the domestic savings rate continued to rise. This was a dream setting for a falling exchange rate because it meant that the internal effects of a fall in the currencies were benign. And that is true. Unfortunately, my colleagues in the party gave that up to Howard and Costello, and they made hay while the sun shone, taking that enormous bequest and sticking it in their pocket. But he goes on to say, he says, the coalitions, he says, when they broke their commitment to pay the extra 6% on superannuation to take it to 15%, he says the government broke economic discipline. It'll turn out that the coalition's greatest crime was to allow the private sector deficit to steadily increase under the mask of Commonwealth budget deficits. And this is the thimble and pea trick which Costello ran for years. That is, we've paid off Labor's debt, but what they first talked about as Labor's debt was a debt truck with 190 billion written on the side of it. That was our external debt abroad. It was not the Commonwealth's budget debt. But when he got to office, Costello, he realised it was a much harder thing to do to restrain the government, the private debt abroad than it was to cut the government debt. So he started then letting the budget, of course, naturally pay itself off as the recovery came through the 90s and tax revenues picked up. And he said, we paid off Labor's debt. In fact, what's happened? The debt went from 200 to 600 billion and is over now 650 billion. And David extrapolates the point that now, would we be sloshing around in these polluted debt markets if we didn't have to borrow the 600 billion and add to it 7% of GDP on the current account every year? In other words, if we'd have taken superannuation from 9 to 15%, the improvement in savings on the current account was worth a further 3% of GDP. So instead of running a current account deficit of around 6% of GDP now, we'd be running at around 3%. In other words, let me make it simple, our banks would not be out there borrowing in New York at rates of interest which reflect the risks in the American financial system to fund the current account deficit because of a paucity of savings here at a time when they're borrowing maturities to under 12 months. Now, there's been a view about, and it's a view that's even in the Treasury, that the current account deficit and the private borrowings abroad are all transactions between consenting adults. That is no place for the government to worry about. Well, all these great tragedies in the American financial system are between consenting adults. We can never stop consenting adults doing silly things, but what we can do, we can reduce our propensity to borrow abroad by lifting our domestic savings. And I don't believe in demand managing the economy to try and change the balance of the current account by cutting back activity. I don't believe in that at all. But I certainly believe in adding to savings. And one of the David quotes here an American, I gave him the quotation, an important American economist saying, "You've got the most strange Conservative Party in the world. A Labor government comes along and encourages the workforce to save 9% of their income and has them agreeing to save 15%, and yet a Conservative government, which ought to at least believe in thrift, comes along and cancels the last 6%. Now, that person was Martin Feldstein, the man who just missed out by one place for the chairmanship of the American Federal Reserve System. And this is not, I've come across this many times, that many people abroad say, what's wrong with the Conservatives in Australia? Don't they understand the gift that a Labor government has done? And Feldstein and others have said to me, if we could just get to 1% of wages in America as savings, we reckon we're doing well. But to get to 9%, it would be enormous. Recently, I turned up to an OECD conference in Europe talking about retirement incomes, and many are interested in the Australian savings system and our superannuation system. And the chairman of the UK Pensions Commission, just recently retired, Lord Adair Turner, got up and said, in a big stentorian voice, all pension systems, he said, have got to have 2 principal features. And I thought, oh, this is good. I've never heard it simplified like this before, but I'll get a note of it. He said the first is that we are all living longer, and the idea that we're going to be retiring at 65 and living till 75 is now over. We're going to be living till 85 or 90, which is correct. He said, therefore, the two key features of our pension system have to be, three features. One, we have to make the public pension less generous. 2, we have to push the pensionable age out to well past 70. And 3, we must give up the whole idea of income replacement in retirement and go to a pension on an anti-destitution basis. Right? Now, this is the best the POMs can offer, you know. You reduce the value of the pension, you push the retiring age out past 70, and we have an anti-destitution model. You know, you get your bread and your eggs and your milk and your postage stamps, and that's about the end of it. Whereas our model was an income replacement model. If people had gone out at 20 years of age at 15% and retired at 65, with the average earning in a fund around about 60%, they'd go out on 125% of average weekly earnings. As it is now, because they chopped the 15% out, the baby boomers, anyone born in the 1940s, can't now be in the system long enough to get any real capital. And now through Costello, we have missed the great boom from 2003 to 2007 and the great lift in incomes and accumulations in pensions and private provisioning. It is impossible now to look after the baby boomers. It's impossible. They can't, there's not enough, and so the reason I was trying to get to 15 early was to front-end load it for the baby boom generation, who will be the first big demand upon the budget in the coming years. So that's now lost, gone for all time. What did Costello do? He introduced a set of changes that said, if you're above 60, you can take your capital in super free, and if you've got $1 million, you can put it in before 30 June 2007. But for the great body of the workforce, nothing. 9%, too good for you anyway. That's where they are. That's where they are. I don't want to go on for too long. I'll just say a few things about building the Reserve Bank. Building the Reserve Bank was a huge undertaking for me. I started out with a bond-selling agency with some very good people. Bob Johnson was an absolute prince of a man, and he had a great staff with him. He was, without a doubt, the most entrepreneurial of our public policy makers. And he and I set about changing the way the Reserve Bank functioned. Firstly, of course, moving to a quantity-based system in setting the exchange rate by floating the currency and removing all export, all controls on capital controls on flows of funds inside and outside of Australia. But one of the points I'd like to make about this thing, you can't take a group of officials who have been appointed by governments for years, and then all of a sudden invest in them the right to shift, the institutional right to shift interest rates up in such a way as to have big effects in the economy. You know, their personalities are not up to it, their authority is not up to it, and so the only way I could get the Reserve Bank to a position where it looked like a central bank was to use my influence, my power, my authority and my strength. And so I gradually let them move the rates. Now, everything was always too slow. In 1989, I was trying to get the rates up to stop the economy overheating and destroying the wages accord. And I had silly John Hewson running around saying that I'd tried to keep rates down during 1980. In fact, the truth was I was trying to get rates up. I was trying to get it up against a central bank bureaucracy which was so cautious and so unschooled in this. I wanted to get rates up and then get them down quickly. And when the switch came to Bernie Fraser, Bernie was in ground. He was no longer just an official in Canberra sending bits of paper to the Treasurer. All of a sudden he's sitting in a job where he's in a position of setting interest rates with a board, and he had the black priest, you mentioned the book, who was Gordon Jackson from CSR.
Bad priest.
A bad priest, yeah. He used to get around in black suits, yeah. And of course he held the board to ransom and wouldn't agree to reducing rates in 1990. And Bernie said, oh, I've got to keep the board together, so I'll go with Gordon. I said, Gordon's a menace. What you do with Gordon is you just step on him. In the end, of course, the recession bit more deeply because the Reserve Bank, not me, didn't get the rates down quickly enough. They didn't get them up quickly enough, they didn't get them down quickly enough. But that was because they lacked the core competencies and confidence to do it. By a few years later, of course, we're now running with low inflation, much easier to control inflation, economy with low inflation. We're getting modest wages growth under the Accord. We've got the Accord marks 6, 7 and 8 endorsing the Reserve Bank's inflation target of 2 to 3% across the cycle. So, I mean, the central bank governor had been sort of hit in the backside by a rainbow. All of a sudden the trade unions are adopting the Reserve Bank's inflation target. And nevertheless,